Isang mainit na pagbati sa inyong lahat. In Kapampangan, dirinanda kayong maya payatu. I give you good greetings. My name is Lily Mendoza, daughter of Esperanza Luna and Horacio Mendoza, born and raised in San Fernando, Pampanga, the traditional homeland of the Aita peoples. I'm coming to you today from the land of Wawiatanong, where the water goes around, home of the Anishinaabe peoples, Wyandot Huron, Fox, Miami, and Saw, otherwise known as the Motown City of Detroit, Michigan, host of the Industrial Revolution in the US, now a poster child for racist neoliberal deindustrialization. Together with my life partner, I live in a part of the city that used to be called Black Bottom, named for its rich, loamy soil, formerly a thriving, predominantly black neighborhood that was demolished for redevelopment in the late 1950s to the early 1960s to give way to a gentrified residential district and a freeway, where the residents were served a mere 30-day notice to vacate what had been their historic home place. And before all the development and the construction of towns and cities was the requisite clear cutting of thick and lush forests and the driving away of wildlife, Michigan being once about 95% forested prior to Euro-American settlement. I name these truths about the place where I currently reside, not just as pro forma, but as part of the discipline of unlearning my settler privilege, recognizing that my presence here on this land as an un-Indigenous person means I am a beneficiary not only of Native genocide, but of African American dispossession and land theft, and prior to that, the ecocide to build this motor city. The title of my talk this morning is We Make Beauty Anyway, Recovering Our Babaylan and Other Wisdom Traditions. As I wrote in the abstract I submitted, in a world full of grief and trauma, unmetabolized and metastasizing into cancer-like growth that is wreaking havoc on the Earth's ecosystems and auguring the end of life as we know it, what is left for us to do? We make beauty anyway is the fierce and stubborn reply of original peoples who still carry a measure of intactness in their lives amidst our modern culture's unrelenting assault. This moment not being their first Holocaust, many in fact have not ever not been in one, fighting the corporate giants that would dam their waters, clear cut their forests, pave over their farmlands, bulldoze their sacred places for real estate development, etc. Their call is not just to fight, but to keep the seeds of real culture alive through the hard lesson of learning to suffer with grace, beauty, and dignity. I have not always seen natural life as beautiful because, like maybe many of you, I am a dyed-in-the-wool child of civilization. Even though I have memories of organic life in my early childhood, climbing the saresa trees in our cousin's backyard and using their tender twigs for hair curlers, catching and releasing gourami fish when the rains caused the nearby creek to overflow and lightly flood the streets of High School Boulevard where we lived, and later tending to the feeding of pigs and chickens which my tatang raised for eggs and meat and to supplement our family income. By the time I was grown enough to be exposed to city life in Manila, where we had cousins, and in Quezon City, where I ended up going to the University of the Philippines for college, my fascination for city living and human-built environment had totally captured my imagination. So much so that somehow I even managed to overcome my nausea and vomiting as a young child whenever I rode a bus, jeepney, or any other motorized vehicle, unable to withstand the gasoline fumes, given that I've been so used to the horse-drawn calesa, which was the ubiquitous means of transportation in San Fernando at the time, before it too got citified and urbanized. When one of my older sisters who lived in Quezon City and her husband bought a car, I especially loved being able to ride with them at night and watch the flashing multicolored neon lights of the city, giving me the feeling that this is the life, fast-paced, progressive, full of glittering technological wonders. It somehow also made me feel, riding in their air-conditioned car, that I had finally arrived, recalling how small I felt as a first-year student in UP, seeing my chauffeur-driven Colegiala college mates alight from their fancy vehicles, not needing to endure the smoke-belching World War II converted jeepneys like I had to. Before then, I also recall my excitement when our parents finally decided they were done with renting at our cousin's basement that periodically got flooded during the rainy seasons, compelling us then to momentarily evacuate upstairs where our cousins lived, and for the first time, gathered whatever savings they had and bought a small nipa hut in Chipaco, still along High School Boulevard, but close to the peripheral fence behind which was the provincial railroad and train station. How excited I was that although the house was a nipa hut, thatched roof, sawali walls, slatted bamboo floors and all, that it at least had the modern marker of a tiled kitchen countertop. And finally, even a modern flushing toilet. We were finally getting civilized. We didn't mind that occasionally we still had to fetch water from the well in front of the house when the water pressure was low. That little nipa hut would eventually undergo an unimaginable series of transformations, beginning with a thatched roof barely kept from being blown off during one strong typhoon, with our tatang tying down the rafters using our two older sisters' cloth belts. Thank goodness for sturdy cloth belts. And gathering us together with lit candles to pray for the storm to finally subside. That was when, in the aftermath, the decision was made to replace the thatched roof with more sturdy galvanized iron. Never mind that it cost us to bake inside, unlike the thatched roof, which was naturally cool. When the tall, heavy-set white women missionaries who were friends with our family, my tang being a Methodist lay leader at the time, and all of us active members of the local Methodist church, when these white missionaries would come visit and we'd find them having to walk gingerly on our bamboo slatted floors, wondering if such quaint flooring was strong enough to hold them up and not break under their weight. We thought then we had better replace the bamboo slats with real, more solid flooring. We thought the further cutting off of air circulation from the lalam bale, the cool dirt space underneath the hut, a small price to pay for what we all thought then was the more proper, more modern type of flooring. Soon, with a newly married sister and her partner needing to stay with us while still unable to be on their own, an extension had to be built as well. By then, what remained of the original nipa hut, the walls made of sawali, also got replaced with concrete, with the resulting mishmash of architectural design causing us to laughingly refer to the monstrosity as one built by Frank Lloyd Wrong, not Frank Lloyd Wright, the famous American architect designer. The house, now completely an oven, especially in the summer, was nothing like the idyllic nipa hut it originally was. It would take decades of psychic and cultural deprogramming before I could make sense of the dissonance I felt over all of those structural transformations. On the one hand, my love for how I felt in the naturally cool little nipa hut, and on the other, the sense of needing to answer to the modernizing imperative of concrete building structures. You see, in the elementary grades, we learned from the textbooks that there were three types of human dwellings: the makeshift, an example of which was the nipa hut; the temporary, built from lumber, logged and supplied by the timber companies; and finally, the permanent one made of concrete, brick, or cement. And the lesson was, were the big bad wolf to come and huff and puff and blow your house down as the tale goes, you had better not be caught in one of those flimsy little nipa huts. Your house had better be permanent, or in the list, a temporary one. Only decades later would I encounter the following passage from an interview with one indigenous writer, Chutuhil Mayan-trained Martin Prechtel, that my husband and I now study with, and I quote, "In the village, people used to build their houses out of traditional materials, using no iron or lumber or nails. But the houses were magnificent. Many were sewn together out of bark and fiber. Like the house of the body, the house that a person sleeps in must be very beautiful and sturdy, but not so sturdy that it won't fall apart after a while. If your house doesn't fall apart, then there will be no reason to renew it. And it is this renewability that makes something valuable. The maintenance gives it meaning." Then, still continuing with the passage, "The secret of village togetherness and happiness has always been the generosity of the people. But the key to that generosity is inefficiency and decay. Because our village huts were not built to last very long, they had to be regularly renewed. To do this, villagers came together at least once a year to work on somebody's hut. When your house was falling down, you invited all the folks over. The little kids ran around messing up what everybody was doing. The young women brought the water. The young men carried the stones. The older men told everybody what to do, and the older women told the older men that they weren't doing it right. Once the house was back together again, everyone ate together, praised the house, laughed, and cried. In a few days, they moved on to the next house. In this way, each family's place in the village was reestablished and remembered. This is how it always was. Then the missionaries and the businesses and the politicians brought in tin and lumber and sturdy houses. Now the houses last, but the relationships don't." Unquote. There is a hiddenness to the beauty of natural life. Eco-theologian Thomas Berry speaks of our romance with modernity and technological progress as a form of trance, calling it the, quote, "mythic power of the industrial vision," unquote. He writes, "Even when its consequences in a desolate planet are totally clear, the industrial order keeps its control over human activities because of the energy created by the mythic quality of its vision." Unquote. Capturing our psychic energies with the promise of wholeness, ginhawa, ever-improving life, fulfillment of our deepest desires and fantasies, and the attainment of pleasure through endless commodity consumption. It's not easy for us now, for those of us modern schooled and fully urbanized, to understand the truth about the industrial age as having a deep mythic structure. After all, modern science, which serves as its foundational scaffolding, is supposed to have secularized social life for good, deeming human beings as primarily ruled by reason and rationality, not by myth and superstition, and the natural world as consisting of objects and dead matter, there for our use and disposition, not one full of living beings and elemental spirits to whom we might owe obligations of care and the observing of limits. Incidentally, one former Christian mentor of mine once said, not without a tinge of pride, that Christianity is to be credited for the rise of modern science, given its understanding of God as transcendent instead of residing in trees, rivers, mountains, rocks, animal beings, etc. And it is this, she said, the distancing of creator from creation that allowed for the full exploration and exploitation of the natural world for our good, without fear of reprisal from the spirit beings formerly believed to inhabit all of creation. Only now are both science and theories on the so-called new materialism catching up and reluctantly conceding agency, not just to nature beings, but to material objects that saturate our commodity world. As I quote from one article on agential realism, the things of this world contribute in a dynamic way to the reality that arises from our engagement with the world, including contributing to the contribution to the constitution of our subjectivity and ways of being. This is a tectonic philosophical shift. Max Weber once described the modern era as the, quote, progressive disenchantment of the world, unquote. A century later, a cohort of philosophers of science are offering an analytic and politicized re-enchantment of the world, unquote. The thing is, we don't need high theory to tell us any of this. Our indigenous ancestors have long taken for granted the animacy of all beings in the world, a truism for all land-taught peoples who haven't yet been atomized, i.e., stripped of all their living connections to the natural world by the dissociating mandate of modern identity. It is what the ritual way of living among indigenous peoples is about, the awareness of humans as only one kind of species relatives among other multitudinous other relatives that includes not just plants or trees or animals, but rocks, minerals, bacteria, water, fire, weather beings, etc. They had better learn to be good kin to others if they are to thrive together in harmony on the only planet we have. So, rituals of courtesy, courtship, honoring, asking for permission, the making of gifts of beauty and eloquence, including that of beautiful ceremonial grieving, are not just the foolish, senseless, time consuming preoccupations of ignorant, primitive folk who haven't yet discovered the virtue of efficiency and learned to hustle, but the very requirement of good creaturehood, to act as though the world belonged to them and that all else is just background relief for the real deal, which is human life. Talk about human supremacy, is to be walang hiya, shameless. To take something from someone without asking for permission and giving something in return is to be walang hiya. And so, as our teacher, Martin Prechtel, notes, the Chutuhil Mayans didn't invent space shuttles or shopping malls or backhoes, not because they can't, but because they don't want to be heavily indebted by taking more than they needed and more than what they could pay for ritually. He notes, and I quote, a knife, for instance, is a very minimal, almost primitive tool to people in a modern industrial society. But for the Mayan people, the spiritual debt that must be paid for the creation of such a tool is great. To start with, the people, the person who is going to make the knife has to build the fire hot enough to produce coals. To pay for that, he's got to give a sacrificial gift to the fuel, to the fire. Once the fire is hot enough, the knife maker must smelt the iron ore out of the rock. A ritual gift equal to the amount that was removed from the other world has to be put back to make up for the wound caused to the divine. When the knife is finished, it is called the tooth of earth. It will cut wood, meat, and plants. But if the necessary sacrifices have been ignored in the name of rationalism, literalism, and human superiority, it will cut humans instead. Unquote. So, speaking of object agency, who is to say that the pathology afflicting our lives today is not the revolt of all the enslaved beings we have forcibly taken from their wild abodes, the iron ore to use for our tools, the trees to build our homes, the coltan and other minerals to install in our gadgets, etc., with nary a thought of ritual asking for permission or acknowledgement and honoring of their service and sacrifice. Whether we realize it or not, the truth is, all labor-saving devices are substitutes for labor originally performed by slaves. He concludes, they, the Chutuhil Mayans, live as they do, not because it's a romantic way to live, it's not. It's enormously hard, but because it works, unquote. I once recalled the Filipino Pomo Indian scholar Greg Saris tell the story of a community of native folk who were mystified at the modern industrial world that surrounded them. They've always believed from the teachings of their ancestors that there are consequences to taking so much from the natural world without giving anything back. But how come, they asked, white people have built all these things and taken so much from the earth without making ritual or giving anything back, and they're still here? In their worldview, any imbalance, any transgression of that fundamental ethic of reciprocity and honoring is certain to cause illness or even death. It has taken a long time, hundreds of years, but the bill is now coming incontrovertibly due. Is it a coincidence, for example, that a sharp spike in global warming has been noted as clearly discernible with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, or that soil depletion has incrementally worsened with monocrop industrial farming, and nutritious biodiverse native seed varieties have been destroyed with the introduction of the so-called green revolution and GMOs, or that the oceans, with all their aquatic life, are now at their death throes, not just from the heating of their waters, but from suffocation from plastic, if not from massive oil spills, or that island nations, including ours, the Philippines, are now at risk of going underwater by sea level rise, or that other species relatives are being disappeared at a rate 1,000 times the normal. This is not even to mention the eating away at our psyches of all kinds of addictions, to psychotropic drugs, especially here in the West, painkillers, mind-numbing entertainment, commodity consumption, societal media. Just recently, you must have heard the expose from the data scientist whistleblower Francis Hogan on the horrific effects of Facebook's algorithms on young teens' sense of self and the fomenting of hate and other extremist views. And not to mention whole nations' addiction to endless wars, criminalization of the poor and powerless, and the profiting from all kinds of carceral regimes, including policing, the military-industrial complex, and border control. But, as Frederick Jameson famously wrote, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of the present world order. Actually, the original quote is, it's easier for us today to imagine the thoroughgoing deterioration of the earth and of nature than the breakdown of capitalism. We can riff on it and say, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of, for example, air conditioning. Indeed, in online talk after talk of Filipino scholars that I've listened to, both at home and abroad, I've only ever heard of concern and complaint of us not getting our own fair share of the global pie of privilege. For example, in our continuing underdevelopment, stymied progress, inability to advance, etc. But none whatsoever of articulating an alternative vision, an alternative path than the road that has brought us and our planet to the verge of ecosystems collapse in the first place. The Cree have a word for what we are witnessing: reticle, civilizational madness. For isn't it the very definition of madness to keep going in the direction of what has brought us to ruin in the first place? There was a time when even native peoples in the US, some of them anyway, were enticed into joining the fray of identity politics, of vying for recognition in order to obtain their own piece of the pie of privilege. But it wasn't long before they realized that the pie itself was toxic, that the condition of civilization's very possibility is the genocide and theft of the lands of peoples deemed less than, i.e., indigenous peoples, the enslavement of others, both human and non-human, the gaming of the system for the benefit of the bottom line, and ultimately, the murder of the planet itself. In the end, they said, no, we want nothing of your pie of privilege. It is laced with poison, and we want no part of it. But how unmask and free ourselves of the mystificatory hold of the narrative of modern progress on our psyches and desires? Poet and cultural theorist Fred Moten once remarked in an interview, anybody who thinks they can come even close to understanding how terrible the terror has been, without understanding how beautiful the beauty has been against the grain of the terror, is wrong. I have often been struck by the emphasis of land-based cultures on beauty, magnificence, and eloquence. As an aside, I don't know if I should be embarrassed to admit that when I see photos of fleeing indigenous refugees, the first thing I notice is not their sad plight or pitiful condition, but the gorgeous, vibrant colors and designs of their clothing fabric or textiles. In fact, my own introduction to indigenous life was through my falling in love with the works of art of our indigenous peoples in a class in the humanities at the University of the Philippines taught by ethnomusicology professor Felipe de Leon Jr., former NCCA chair. And this is a story I can't help sharing, given its pivotal significance in my journey of transformation. These were communities the farthest removed from the reach of modern schooling and Christian missionization. I wrote, from the wild, untamed beauty of complex geometric weaving designs, the mellifluous melodies able to call up grief out of all its hidden places, polyphonic sounds and rhythms coming from native instruments that not only sounded but looked utterly beautiful, to the intricate architectural structures that used not a single nail to bind parts together, etc. And all of these creations of beauty ritually sourced, many given in dreams, with materials taken from the wild, only with the requisite respect, honoring and asking for permission, and always in service of beauty. My response was visceral. Walking out of every class session, I would find myself in tears, bawling my heart out, not knowing what it was that hit me from all the innocent descriptions of those works of art and what they express in terms of a different way of being in the world. It is only later that I would understand what those works of art encoded, namely, the people's love affair with the earth. As our teacher would put it, and I quote, my experience has always been, if you love something or someone passionately enough, you will amplify your heart, eschew ancestral biases, open your mind, train your hands, and go to any extent to learn the language of what you love, to comprehend and be comprehended in order to converse with the divine in the thing you love, unquote. And because what they're in relationship with is this vast, magnificent earth, showing up in wild arrays of colors, forms, ways of being, and at times terrifying fierceness, they themselves have to match her brilliance, her magnificence, and her fierceness in their own ways of being. Beauty, as it turns out, is understood to be the food the gods love to eat. Again, in the words of our teacher Martin Prechtel, and I quote, the gods love our poetry, our offering shrines, our beautiful clothing, the complex chirping banter of our village streets, and especially the expansive combination of all our abilities into ritual offerings and ceremonies. The gods perceive us as delicious fruit. They love our excesses as long as they are beautiful, and the gods got to eat a lot of them. Unquote. For that matter, even non-indigenous scholar anthropologist Michael Tausig recounts something similar in his book, What Color is the Sacred, when he writes, referencing Goethe, and I quote, "Men, and I would add women, in a state of nature, uncivilized nations and children have a great fondness for colors in their utmost brightness. The same applied to uneducated people and Southern Europeans, especially the women with their bright colored bodices and ribbons. On the other hand, Goethe notes, people of refinement had a distinction to colors, women wearing white, the men black. And not only in dress. When it came to what Goethe called pathological colors, people of refinement avoid vivid colors in the objects around them and seem inclined to banish vivid colors from their presence altogether." Unquote. He likens the encounter between the two to an uneasy encounter between two presences. He says, "It is as if there are two presences glowering at each other, shifting uncomfortably from one foot to the other. It is, it is as much a body thing, a presence thing. One presence is people of refinement, the other is vivid color." Unquote. That was how it was for me, my utterly civilized, domesticated, disciplined, Christianized body, encountering the utter brilliance and vibrancy of our indigenous ways of being in that class in the humanities. My body's response was to be blown away. The people's wonderment at the natural world that is still their home, showing up unfiltered in the originality and creativity of their dances, their chanting, their weaving, and in the openness of their loob to spirit guidance through dreaming, the eloquence of their ritual honoring of the more than human beings in the particularities of their given ecologies, the amazing techniques of ecstasy and trance in their transaction with ancestors and the spirit world, and their beautiful ceremonies. In my subsequent encounters with our indigenous peoples, whether in Kapwa conferences hosted by the couple Katrin de Guia and Kidlat Tahimik, or Pamati gatherings or organized by Tao Foundation through our collaborator and Kapwa elder Grace Nono, or in our own Center for Babaylan Studies gatherings, where Native elders always grace us with their presence, and in our ongoing work with a number of indigenous communities in the homeland, I have yet to cease being blown away. And the more I learn of the source and wellspring of that beauty, the more compelled I am to strive to learn in all the ways that I can to access and embody the wisdom. The earth herself is the ultimate teacher, but indigenous peoples are the remaining rememberers and keepers of the wisdom she holds. Today, I currently serve as an elder at the Center for Babaylan Studies, a movement committed to the twin goals of decolonization and indigenization. As you know, the term Babaylan refers to the spiritual tradition of our indigenous peoples, one which is rooted in a reverential relationship with the natural world. Babaylan is only one of the many ethno-linguistic terms encoding the sense of the sacred among our land-based communities. Other terms are Baylan, Balyan, Mambunong, Patutunong, Manganito, Catalonan, Mumbaki, Maaram, etc., with each indigenous community having their own unique, ecologically coded ritual practices and healing modalities. Babaylans are known as wisdom keepers, healers, ritualists, and mediators between the human and the more than human realms. Majority women, but also some men. They are those who either through gifting of ancestral lineage or specific calling, possess competency to hear and speak the languages of nature's spirits and other beings. For them, listening to the land is not a metaphor. And part of the training is to live at the edge of the village, with a primary communion not with humans, but with the natural world. Trading in eloquence and ornate prayers, chants, and intricate ritual dances, they would say that the rituals themselves are not their own inventions, but ones given or taught to them by the land. Indeed, all healing ultimately comes from the wild. This is what they know. It is the way people are taught to keep their covenantal relationship with the earth, so they know not to exceed their limits, not to be trifled with because of their great spiritual power. During colonial times, the Babaylans were simultaneously feared, maligned, and demonized by both the Spanish friars and the American missionaries. Christianity and Enlightenment rationality, casting their differing modalities of relating to the spirit world to the realm of the pathological, if not outright satanic. And if the traditional cultures were to be destroyed, and the peoples coaxed away from their backward living and brought into the light of progress and modernity, these wisdom keepers, who are the pillars of their communities, needed to be destroyed. But they are still with us, these wisdom keepers, and that in itself is the marvel, given the unrelenting assault of our modern industrial culture, not only in its drive to mine, dig, cut, dam what remains of the wild earth, but in working its own brand of wonders, its mesmerizing bling and techno gadgets on the young, drawing their souls away from their mooring in their ancestors' traditions. So many of the elders we met grieve they're no longer wanting to sit at their feet and learn from what they have to give. In the schools, the totalizing logic of modern industrial culture reigns supreme. If ever indigenous thought were to make it into the curriculum, it's only in a token gesture of inclusion. For without the teachers themselves understanding its radically different cultural logic, it fails to call into question the fundamental untenability of our entire way of life, much less break the spell of modernity's psychic capture of our deepest desire and longing. What does it mean to really live and embody indigenous wisdom? There's a favorite quote from Arundhati Roy that I like to cite. She says, and I quote, "The first step towards reimagining a world gone terribly wrong would be to stop the annihilation of those who have a different imagination, an imagination which has an altogether different understanding of what constitutes happiness and fulfillment, who may look like the keepers of our past, but who may really be the guides to our future." And what does it take to stop the ongoing annihilation of indigenous peoples, who, I submit, are today the only remaining other of modernity, the only ones with a different imagination from the rest of us, assimilated ones? To answer this question is first to know what it is that we understand is killing them. So, what is it that is killing them? What is killing them is the theft of their lands. That land is life is not a metaphor for them. What is killing them is the damming and polluting of the rivers that they hold sacred and that they depend upon for their daily sustenance. What is killing them is the clear cutting of the forest that is their source of nurturance, their food pantry and medicine cabinet. What is killing them is the blowing off of mountain tops and the poisoning of the land by mining, oil, and geothermal prospecting activities. But what is also killing them is what is taught in the schools and in the public discourse about the purported backwardness and undesirability of humans having to live on the land? And why are all these destructive projects being foisted upon them, on a people for whom the desecration of all they hold dear and holy constitutes much less grief and horror? It is because we, cityfied urban dwellers, need the minerals and metals under their feet for our gadgets, the hydroelectric power from their violently dammed rivers to power our heavy resource living, their stolen lands for suburban development and as playground for the rest of us, and because we ourselves have lost our capacity to do things for ourselves, having outsourced the very business of real living, i.e., the growing of food, the building of shelters, the producing of fibers for our clothing, etc., and having thus become dependent on the industrial machine to do for us what we used to be able to do for ourselves. In exchange, what we're compelled to do is to hire ourselves out as wage earners to the very corporate machine that's back behind the whole murderous system. One elder expressed it simply: your way of life is killing our way of life. Today, the Philippines, shamefully, has just surpassed Brazil as the country with the highest rate of murder of indigenous peoples in the world. Mostly land defenders mercilessly red-tagged and extrajudicially executed without any recourse to justice or restitution. Let that sink in for a moment. Our way of life is killing their way of life. How long are we willing to countenance such travesty? Secondly, we need to recover a different sense of understanding of the purpose of our lives here on earth. For this, I take liberty in sharing 5 principles taught us by our indigenous teacher, Martin Prechtel. Principles I've seen equally manifest in what I've witnessed among our own indigenous Kapwa, if not so explicitly articulated. Here is the first principle. People, the earrings of the earth, are not here to succeed at what they want, unless what they want is to become the beauty that makes the world jump up and live again. In the amazing chance that you do get what you want, marvel at the generosity of what you're given and give thanks. And for Prechtel, part of the misery of civilization is precisely the result of people insisting on getting what they want, where what they want has nothing at all to do with making beauty that can feed life and cause the world to jump up and live again. His own learning from the native people that took him in and that he eventually became an apprentice to and ended up becoming inheritor of the heart of the village after the whole village was decimated by death squads during the 1980s Guatemalan Civil War, caused him to observe, and I quote, "The Chutuhil were not trying to build an unsuffering world. The world they were part of was not run by humans, and it had only live things residing in it. There were no dead things. Instead of eradicating all the misery of the world, the Chutuhil were trying to suffer together creatively in a beautiful way to keep their world of delicately balanced live things more vital by feeding it the grief of their human failures and stupidity. These failures were made beautiful by the ornate and graceful way the people dedicated their suffering to the earth and to that which made life live, in a proven ritual attitude of great antiquity." Unquote. The second principle is this: make beauty, become a bead in the necklace of time. You owe 101% of what you get. This is the grief of indebtedness that you may not escape. Refusing to be indebted is what it means to flee and not want to be in relationship with the holy in nature. This concept of indebtedness is one we cannot escape. Simply by being born, we consume other living beings in order to live, and because of this, we incur a debt to the holy in nature. This debt must be repaid with creations of beauty, either a gift made with hands, which the gods don't have, or with eloquent speech or beautiful grieving. Practel observes of the Chutuhil Mayans, 51% of their economy is spent on offering. Offering is about maintaining the relationship. 51% of the caloric expenditure is for the holy in nature. It is gorgeous, and the lifestyle is sustainable. It is, by necessity, required to stay small, and there's no chance for profit. Anybody who is rich means they're not making enough offerings. Once a culture becomes imperialized, people who still have memory of this spiritual way of relating to the earth realize the depth of their indebtedness, and the practice then shifts from offering to sacrifice, including human sacrifice. This is the original agreement that all intact indigenous peoples understand. Third principle, never lose your sense of awe. What makes you live from one sense of wonder to the next? Learn to listen to the little people, both human and the more than human, those our modern world of grief deems small and insignificant. As I was preparing for this talk, my husband put me onto an article he just read on the nature of wonder. In it, it said that other beings have it too, the capacity for wonder, as described by the primatologist Jane Goodall. And I quote, she was observing her chimpanzees in Gombe when she noticed a male chimp gesturing excitedly at a beautiful waterfall. He perched on a nearby rock and gaped at the flowing torrents of water for a good 10 minutes. Goodall and her team saw such responses on several occasions. She concluded that chimps have a sense of wonder, even speculating about a nascent form of spirituality in our simian cousins, unquote. How do we not let our entrancement with modern technology, whose driving impetus is not an honoring relationship, but conquest and enslavement of matter, to severely compromise our vision, so we no longer have capacity for awe and wonder. Indeed, human supremacy precludes it. What do we do when even our real life encounter with other animals has only been with the domesticated kind, or with their caged and severely traumatized cousins, ones that natural philosopher Paul Shepard speaks of as genetic goofies, deformed animals whose wild genetic homeostasis has been destroyed? And how might we begin to push back against civilization's attempts to domesticate all life, including us, and recover again our capacity for true wonder? Fourth principle, remember always to give praise and ask permission, not just from human beings, but from the more than human beings. It's all about approach and courtesy. Again, it is what ritual living is about. Ritual has nothing to do with humans. Creating beautiful ritual is not so you can take photos of it and post it on Facebook and earn accolades for it. If so, you've already received your reward. Ritual is for the holy in nature. When our healers don't just take or harvest, but first court and sing to the mother plant to request her to lower her medicine for a loved one who is sick, that is ritual, a beautiful offering to the holy. Finally, the fifth and last principle, and I love this. The wear and tear from not getting what you want is what gives you wisdom. By wearing down, you become a tool that's useful for something else, This is what nature does. Taste the magnificentness of that. I love that word, magnificentness. If then life is not primarily about us, but a much bigger reality, both magnificent in its grandeur and in its terrifying power ultimately to devour us, how shall we then live? In a recent essay I wrote, I make reference to a witness of fierce loving and beauty amidst a 1976 7.5 Guatemalan earthquake that killed 31,000 and displaced more than 180,000. This is one more time from a book by our teacher, Martin Prechtel, The Unlikely Peace of Cuchimakik, The Parallel Lives of People as Plants, where he writes, and I quote, some 300 people were huddled out in the open in extended family groups, exhausted, famished, and in pain, convinced the world was ending everywhere, but resolved to live their last moments together with all the beautiful honorifics and respectful courtesy they exhibited in everyday life under normal circumstances. They had come to pass the world's end at the place all Mayans, every village and tribe, know as their Rumukuks, or the umbilicus of the world. They wanted the symphony of their thousand-year struggle to live in the arms of the corn seed's earth, to end here where it had begun, at the place of their mutual origins. In this way, they themselves would become spiritual seeds, and their passing become temporal humus from which the divine could regrow a world beyond their own time. In their parallel understanding of vegetation and human culture, they wanted to be rooted in the earth's memory of their having been here, of their having been there, even if they as humans had to disappear. After all the mythologies said that they as people had themselves sprouted from a time previous to any of our own presence, and like seeds had resprouted themselves from the compost of a world of previous human failures. The trick was not to seek the fantasized comfort or the falsely anchored dependability that civilization promises. Instead of the illusion of security, it's better to get good at riding out Earth's motion like a bone cell heaving in the ribs of her breathing chest, and heaving she was. I remarked in my essay, their witness was and is astonishing, putting virtually every modern reaction to similar kinds of emergency to shame. There was no frenzy, no opportunism, no crazed hysteria seeking self-preservation. There was just calm acknowledgement of an irreducible magnificence that would continue to grace this world's wild fierceness of motion and life, whether death would come quickly or wait another time. The example is epochal, and for me, epic. I feel this is a time when, like the people of Cuchimakik, we no longer come together just to have a better chance at survival, but rather to learn to prepare for a time beyond our own, to sow seeds of love for the holy in nature that can resprout after the dying, or even something as radical as extinction. My sister Lenny tells of the words of a Manobo elder in a gathering with some teachers from California who came to hear her share the struggles of her people. But her plea was not what they expected. She said, and I quote, "Please allow us to express our beauty," unquote. And perhaps if we listen well, if we have the ears to hear and the heart to comprehend, this is the message we will hear from all original peoples everywhere. all the way to death's door. We make beauty anyway. Please allow us to express our beauty. And that is all we need to hear. Maraming salamat po.